Hello, this is Pacific.ca from the Pacific coast of Canada. On the previous segment of this series, BC legislators discussed the proposed modernization of the Agricultural Land Reserve Act in order to increase transparency and accountability. And also they discussed the creation of 6 regional panels of administration. We continue today with the third proposed reform to the Agricultural Land Reserve. That is, to separate the existing 1 agricultural land reserve zone into 2 zones.
Change the administration of the Agricultural Land Reserve to reflect the regional differences that exist in British Columbia by establishing 2 zones within the province. By creating 2 ALC-administered zones, we are allowing for responsible opportunities on farmland in Zone 2 while maintaining the status quo in Zone 1. The purpose of our bill is to ensure the ALR is working for British Columbians and successfully balancing our desire to protect valuable farmland and further support farming families and the farming sector. By broadening the decision-making criteria used by the ALC in adjudicating applications in Zone 2, the ALC will be able to achieve its common goals of protecting farmland, addressing the interests of farm families, and allowing for responsible economic development opportunities when the ALC believes it is appropriate.
The creation of 2 zones creates fundamental inequality in this legislation, and I think therein lies one of its biggest weaknesses, in that land owned by farmers and by people involved in agriculture in the South is supposedly protected, remains protected, obviously implying that land in the other zone is no longer protected.
As we said from the outset, British Columbia is a large and diverse province with different agricultural practices, different populations, and different pressures. And it's a province with different social and cultural realities in our different regions. A one-size-fits-all approach to regulating the use of farmland does not reflect this reality.
If you want to talk about Zone 1 and Zone 2 and what agricultural land is better than others, this government, by underfunding the Commission, has allowed prime agricultural land in Zone 1 to be destroyed because they have no policy on soil dumping in the Lower Mainland, and that land is turning into land that you can't farm on anymore. So don't talk to me about Zone 1 and Zone 2 and soil classifications. This government is responsible for destroying much of the Prime 1 land that has soil and clay and construction fill on top of it right now. Not just a couple loads. In Saanich, we had 10,000 loads of construction fill put on a farm.
The development and population pressure in Zone 1 is significantly greater than that in Zone 2. And that's why it makes sense to keep Zone 1 a status quo.
And what we really should be doing is shoring up the protections of the land in the South, or in the regions that government refers to as Zone 1, because we see the vast majority of agricultural land lost to the province of BC has been in those zones that are supposedly still being protected.
Now, you can tell that I'm bringing forward evidence to make a case, Mr. Speaker, a case that agriculture in BC's north is qualitatively and quantitatively different than agriculture in the south. They're 2 different worlds that we're talking about, and that means that we need to treat them differently. We have to take into account the different circumstances of the very different areas of our province, and that's what we've done in this bill.
And when you localize decision-making and make it such an immediate kind of a question between, do you want to use this now for housing or later for growing food, the economic impact is greater if you say now for building something.
I also see evidence of what I call the lonely tractor syndrome. It's where you see farmers that have gone out and they put their life savings into developing a farm. They put their life savings into buying a tractor and equipment. And they're working the land, and they find out that the return on investment just isn't there. The land is not returning back what they've put into it or what they've tried to put into it. and these tractors sit abandoned on the fields. You know, some of them have been there for 20, 30 years and more. And you see that all over the place. So a lot of the farmers and a lot of my extended family members up there have gone to look at secondary income to try and support the farm.
It's a question of making sure that decisions are made impartially, in a way that is based on science, is based on the specific facts as adjudicated from a provincial view. The agricultural land reserve was not protected for Zone 1 people or Zone 2 people. The province is all one zone.
Now, I want to point out that the Agricultural Land Commission's mandate in law is first and foremost to protect agricultural land and encourage farming on that land, and that is great. We support that. It's not, though, to protect the livelihoods of farmers or to make sure that they remain viable on the land. It's not to protect farm families or farm communities. It's just to protect agricultural land and farming on that land. And the ALC does this effectively, but for all the reasons I've just been talking about, farms in BC's north are less viable than farms in the south.
I do know how they can justify this in terms of immediate economic gain. I know, because sometimes, you know, obviously, it's probably going to get more out of the land if you put, you know, drill a big hole and get some natural gas out of it than you will if you dig a bunch of holes and grow grain. But we need grain.
One extra way we can help farms in BC's north is to pass this bill before us today, because the bill creates what is a natural division in BC, 2 zones for the Agricultural Land Commission to consider, 2 zones that recognize the 2 different worlds that farmers occupy in our province.
90% of the agricultural land reserve is now in Zone 2. The highest and best use for agriculture. Under the Agricultural Land Reserve and the Commission, the highest and best use is supposed to be for agriculture, not for something else, not for supporting the oil and gas industry, not for a rodeo. It's supposed to be about growing food, Mr. Speaker.
But agriculture is not the main economic driver in the north. And I would remind the House that although 90% of the agricultural land in the ALRs in the north, it only produces 10% of the farm gate receipts. Right now, the main economic driver in the north is natural resource development. And in the foreseeable future, this is going to be the same. Because we in this government are intent on developing our natural gas resources to the benefit of every person in this province, the main economic driver in the north is going to be natural gas and mining and logging and things like that.
Well, you know what? I know a ton of young people who want to get into farming, but farming looks a little bit different, and it's reflecting what consumers want, and that's about modernizing agriculture. It's about supporting agriculture. It's about things like the Local Food Act. It's not about destroying the agricultural land reserve because the old way of doing business doesn't work. It's about putting policies in place that make agriculture work, not taking away the land that you can do that on.
And what does it mean for developing in the north if we develop these kinds of natural resources? More activity in mining and natural gas will mean higher population in the north. It'll mean more demand for food. It'll mean higher incomes and higher land prices for farmers, better services available to rural areas. In short, the way to increase viability of farms and farmers and farm communities in BC's north is to develop the economy of the north, and we're already doing this through the development of natural resources in the north.
But areas that everyone should understand is that the motivation for this is actually real estate. This is real estate. That is the motivation, and that is the central flaw in this bill.
The sole purpose of this bill is to recognize that running a farm operation in the southern half of British Columbia is far different than in the northern half of the province. That's all it is, Honourable Speaker. There is nothing nefarious about this whatsoever.
You make a certain zoning decision, you may increase the value of property tremendously, you may devalue adjoining properties, but the zoning decision is important not only for quality of life, but because it affects the value of property. Think of the ALR for what it is, which is essentially a provincial zoning policy.
Now, let me give you an example how this new flexibility for the ALR might work out in practice in the North, Mr. Speaker. Let me give you just one example. A farmer might want to operate a second business out of the family farm which might allow the farm to remain viable. It might be a business that services the natural gas industry for parts of the year. It wouldn't necessarily mean taking land out of the ALR. It would simply allow an off-farm stream of income to supplement farm income to allow the farmer to prosper and remain on the land.
The Agricultural Land Reserve, when it was set up in the 1970s, saw the province as an entity, one entity. You weren't going to distinguish between, effectively, the north, as is happening now, or the interior, and the lush farming belt of the Fraser Valley, of the Cowichan Valley, of the Comox Valley, of the Okanagan, where we have now fruit and wineries. It was supposed to be an entity. The very fact that this bill splits that entity in two, making it two zones, is a move to the destruction of the Agricultural Land Reserve.
In Zone 1, where there are different growth pressures and significant urbanization, it remains status quo. In Zone 2, by broadening the decision-making criteria used by the ALC in adjudicating applications, the ALC will be able to achieve its common goals of protecting farmland, addressing the interests of farm families, and allowing for responsible economic development opportunities when they believe this is appropriate.
This bill proposes to remove agricultural protection as the key consideration for 90% of ALR land. 90%. Yes, all of Zone 2. All of Zone 2. That's correct. Preserving agricultural land and farming will be only one of a series of factors the Commission members must consider. And so it's no longer the primary consideration. That only remains in Zone 1. So 90% of the ALR land.
In Zone 1, there are clearly development pressures and other demands for that land, and that is why we have kept Zone 1 status quo. In Zone 2, after considering whether the land should be maintained for agricultural purposes, the independent ALC can then look at other factors in descending order of priority before rendering a decision.
The Agricultural Land Reserve was never about, nor should it have been about, one part of the province. The Agricultural Land Reserve has never been about regional interests. The Agricultural Land Reserve and the mandate of the Agricultural Land Commission has been about protecting British Columbia's farmland for present and future generations.
But because the growing season in the southern part of the province is somewhat longer, this provides farmers with a window of opportunity to rebound and plant another crop. This might not be the case for farmers up north who have a much shorter growing season. So it therefore makes sense to consider the province in two different distinct separate zones for the purposes of agriculture to match the suitability of land use contained within the ALR.
This is Calgary's backyard. This is Calgary's playground. This is where they come to buy recreational property, and they will pay top dollar. Top dollar. Where are the areas that they want for this recreational properties? They are areas that are in the Agricultural Land Reserve. But they have no intention of farming it.
What we are trying to do is give the northern half of this province a greater degree of flexibility when it comes to agricultural land use. There is nothing wrong with giving northern farmers the potential to expand their current operations beyond current restrictions.
That land is under pressure. If you are able to get land out of the ALR, then you will make incredible amounts of money.
The LNG pipelines themselves develop geothermal power. There's heat, there's all kinds of things in that. So if you go to a pipeline right away, the ground thaws out a lot sooner than the ground surrounding it up there. So maybe there's some opportunities there to look at perhaps planting crops on some of the right-of-ways that LNG is going to be developing up there.